Let's rip the band-aid off. Luffy does not have Toon Force. Just like how Goku fans want Goku to be Yogg the Thoth from Cthulhu Mythos, One Piece fans want Luffy to be Bugs Bunny. It's at the moment you've awoken from this grand illusion you decide to say this on One Piece Twitter, it's basically seen as heresy. Because
how dare you say that our lovable MC isn't a goofy character that can do goofy things with his goofy abilities?
Not like Oda didn't already say that the intent behind Luffy being a rubber man in the first place was for him to be an unconventional MC of goofy powers, but, you know, let's just forget that even happened, even though the One Piece fandom is the one to say argue with Oda as a common counter-argument. Now, with Wano finally coming to its conclusion, the anime and Egghead on the horizon, I feel like it's best we talk about the biggest misconceptions surrounding Gear 5 and how people interpret Luffy's newly awakened Devil Fruit, to say that Luffy has attained something known as Toon Force. But obviously, spoilers ahead for those who wish not to be spoiled. So what even is Toon Force? As simple as it may sound and how simplistic the most common definition may seem, Toon Force is still one of the most convoluted ideas in power scaling. Let me explain. The definition that is most often cited is the one from Versus Battle Wiki that states, an ability that refers to characters manipulating reality or bypassing physical laws of nature in order to achieve impossible feats for comedic effects. The users bend reality in such a way to make situations comedic and funny. It should not be confused with reality warping, which can affect reality in more serious ways. Now, this may seem simple on the surface, but as most would point out, the fact that its classification is basically reality warping contingent on being funny not only makes it seem like Toon Force is a very situational and that it's a far more limited of an ability, but also that it's contingent on the reader's interpretation to distinguish Toon Force and a simple gag moment, making the whole idea of declaring what is Toon Force and what isn't much more difficult to nigh impossible and entirely subjective. Which is why I'm not super fond of this definition in itself, because I believe it to be way too vague. Because any person infected with the semantic brainworms can make a sound argument that a lot of things could then be considered Toon Force when it could simply just be coincidentally a comedic moment or a harmless gag. Which conveniently, no one has actually made a proper distinction of what is an example of it and what isn't under this same definition. So if we're going to make the attempt to make a better, more predictive, falsifiable model for deciding what Toon Force is, we need a more strict definition. One that is wide enough to be applied to many situations, but strict enough to where not every funny moment is now Toon Force. But unfortunately, this will mean taking up a new idea that suggests an uproot of old ideas, which I'm going to predict a lot of people in the comments section are not going to be fond of. So sit back and relax as we take a look back at the past to find out where this idea might have come from.
Presenting this week from Fantasyland, The Plausible Impossible.
In the period of 1954 to 1958, Disney made an episode called The Plausible Impossible, for which was narrated and presented by Walt Disney himself. In the episode, he explains this idea that he admittedly didn't invent, but that it has been around seemingly as long as humans have been able to tell stories. It's with this concept that birthed the reason behind why animation and the certain laws regarding it behave the way they do, as it's the proposed idea that something may seem like fantasy or absurd can be made believable or real enough when sprinkling in a drop of reality, allowing someone to be able to read along or understand something without questioning the logic behind it. One of the examples he presented was, while the idea of humans with animal heads may seem like fantasy to us, to the ancient Egyptians, because they were supernatural gods, it was believable enough for them to believe that these beings might have existed. Just like how dragons seemed like real beings to the ancient Chinese, but to us, we can summarize that it could have been an instance where ancient humans could have seen dinosaurs and in an exaggerated retelling created the idea of the dragon. With cartoons, similar logic is used to make something that is illogical in reality to still seem plausible in fiction. He goes on to state how as long as the actions in cartoons has some basis in fact, it can be believable enough for an audience to still comprehend what's happening without having to question the physics, implying that a lot of instances in Western animation, or animation in general, aren't always made on the basis of what would be funny, but, as they suggest, what's impossible for it to happen in reality, but is still plausible enough that it can occur within animation and not be seen as weird or random. Sure, entertainment and comedy is considered whenever you're trying to make an enjoyable story. No one is denying that. The point is that the misconception that people have nowadays, just like Walt Disney summarizes, is that we now think about things much more logically in order to make sense of old ideas. With the idea in question being Toon Force, which people basically think that any quote-unquote impossible feat in most Western animation isn't a product of what the character is capable of, but that it must be a byproduct of some external force or internal energy system that allows these feats to occur. Because if it's not some Japanese anime or Western comic book where every little detail gets explained by something, people get upset and try to make sense of it, even if the evidence might not even exist. Which is kind of ironic since we're talking about the One Piece fandom, which is often associated with theorists that try to make comparisons or correlations that are more of a stretch, if anything. But let's move on. However, there may be some reason behind the madness of Toon Force's existence, despite what I'm saying. As often cited, Art Babbitt, an animator from Walt Disney Studios, once said, "Animation follows the laws of physics unless it is funnier otherwise." While some would immediately jump on this being Toon Force's existence being confirmed, others have pointed out how this isn't only applicable to just the laws of physics, and that there are numerous examples of similar absurdities occurring that happen for the sake of comedy and have no correlation to breaking the laws of physics. On the flip side, there are also numerous instances in animation or even in science fiction CGI films where the laws of physics are broken but have nothing to do with the moment being comedic. So this one citation from one animator doesn't really tell the whole truth or confirm anything about Toon Force's existence. What it does talk about is how the mindset of the animator is that they formulate a story and the rules of their world centered around entertaining the audience, as they only focus on keeping things realistic enough until the precise moment in which they feel like they can bend them for the sake of a certain moment. Now, the bigger issue is when most try to cite that Toon Force is something that exists across all forms of Western animation. If you go strictly off of empirical evidence, the only series that might have this phenomenon existing is Looney Tunes, as cited by Roger Rabbit in Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Thanks. Do you mean to tell me that you could have taken your hand out of that cuff at any time?
No, not at any time. Only when it was funny.
Which, even in the film, portrays the fact that Toon Force, if we even call it that, doesn't make a toon invincible or unbeatable, and that their powers only work for the purposes of entertainment and comedy. So to talk about them in a versus battle scenario, in the way that some people want us to, makes it not only tricky and fanfiction-y, but a subject of what we call combat headcanon, which is essentially the whole idea of talking about two characters fighting, then acting like you're currently plugging a controller into the character and making them do whatever you want, trying to play out the debate as if you're currently writing out a fanfiction of a fight, when realistically, versus battle discussions are more or less who hits first, what win cons do they have, and is it in character and or consistent for them to do this? So when most try to assert that this is how Toon Force works, an ability that could do whatever for the funny, there are two different ways to take it. And the way people want to take it, we basically assume that Toon Force is this ability that does make a character practically unbeatable, and that any retort can be countered with a hilarious moment constructed by the person's imagination. Which is a basic no limits fallacy that assumes that these characters must be this broken when they have yet to be proven as such. But if we were to try to make it work under proper logic, it makes whatever they're capable of seem very limited, extremely circumstantial, and overall purely subjective. Which again, is not what people want, but that's ultimately how it would have to work. Now, could it be how it works in the way that it was first suggested? Possibly. But is the evidence there that they are these invincible characters incapable of losing? Absolutely not. And we're essentially running into the same problem that people use when talking about Saitama from One Punch Man and gag characters in general. Could they be capable of feats to which they claim? Maybe, but until the evidence gets presented to us, all we could say is that they could, which is just us theorizing and not proving something actually is the case. Because while a lot of toons, at least in Looney Tunes, might have this implicit uncanny awareness of comedic timing, but this doesn't mean they're immeasurably intelligent to the point where you can come up with a fan fiction of how they can defeat practically anyone. Again, to act like they would just be capable of anything, as long as it's funny, even for this plausible reason, is both a no limits fallacy and provably untrue. If we want to talk about them in a versus battle scenario in a coherent manner, we would have to then treat them like any other fictional character. In other words, only claim what they are proven to be capable of, not what they might be capable of. Even if a character's feats are the result of Toon Force, they are only capable of what they're shown to be capable of, despite where the source of their powers might come from. Toon Force isn't some separate layer of attack where if you don't resist Toon attacks, it just one-shots you or something. Just like not all magic users are capable of the same thing because they are users of magic. So even if we conform to this idea and said that all Western animation has Toon Force, it doesn't make them all the same level of strength or anything. So it doesn't make sense for anyone to claim this unless some are that ignorant of how basic analysis works. Or they have this agenda they need to push that requires both themselves and other people to believe this in order to prove their favorite character is as strong as they want them to be. Which is the subject of today's video, and we will get to that in a second. But to summarize, if I were to give a proper definition, this is what it would be. Toon Force is a governing law that grants a user almost any supernatural or practical ability and/or resist almost any damage as long as it suits the comedic effect of the current circumstance. It is not to be assumed to be an unlimited ability capable of making any character invincible in any situation, but one that is contingent on the user to have an uncanny understanding of comedic effect to make it work. Even with it, it means the limitations are imposed by the user's reliance on having to wait for and/or make a situation/scenario universally comedic for it to be invoked. Now, in all transparency, this was my best attempt at trying to make the idea of Toon Force to be a tangible thing in fiction, without it being too similar to the idea of reality warping, which itself is an equally vague and nebulous term, which we can talk about another day. This was simply to appease those who still find it a worthy enough concept to exist in these types of conversations, when realistically, I think it'd be better for everyone to stop acting like an idea of Toon Force even exists, especially in the way that people nowadays define it, since it's mainly just an idea that panders to people's disbelief that such characters are coincidentally only capable of bizarre feats when the comedic moment arises, while relying on the use of other citations of the cartoon physics Wikipedia to further push this agenda that such a concept might exist. And it seems that every time people are challenged on this to even give a good explanation as to why Toon Force is that much different than the term reality warping, which, as I said before, has very muddy water surrounding it as well, no one can seemingly give a better explanation other than it's a limited form of it that is only distinguished by its intention of it being a comedic or gag moment. Let that sink in for a second. The big differentiating factor from normal reality warping is that its intention is to be funny. Which then brings up the other issue of Toon Force that I referenced earlier, is that then having to make the effort of making up the distinction between a demonstration of Toon Force and a simple gag moment unrelated to anything the character's capable of. Essentially, the people who want Toon Force to be a thing would then be forced to provide empirical evidence of this existing and that the character in question derived their powers from it, which I believe is safer to say Toon Force doesn't exist than to even pander to my own definition of the term. Now, to those who listen to this whole video just to comment about how your verse actually has Toon Force as established power, and you think that refutes everything I've said in this video, well, you're wrong. Because by saying that, you are sidestepping the issue. as what I'm actually talking about is the assertion that Toon Force is some universal power that many people have, and it always has these very specific qualities, etc. I have never been opposed to any verse actually having a power called Toon Force that actually behaves this way. Now, with all that being said, I believe the conclusion of Luffy having Toon Force as a result of Gear 5 is at best an incredibly ignorant position, and at worst, a dishonest one. As more often than not, most people that rep this position would rather try to tie anything Luffy does in the manga or anime as a result of Toon Force, rather than trying to use what is given to us by the story to even make it internally consistent with itself. For example, one of the silliest arguments I have seen are the recallings of characters having their eyes pop out of their head during Luffy and Kaido's fight, which is declared by the fandom as a product of Toon Force, despite the several instances prior to Wano even occurring of this being a common gag moment within both the anime and manga, with the majority of them coming from Usopp, or even instances where Sanji's eyes become hearts as a part of his gag of being extremely aroused by women. And it's not like these scenes are hard to miss or something I just stumbled across on a reread. These are literally the defining traits of both characters that can be noticed even if you are only an anime watcher. But seemingly, Luffy is the only one being accredited as the Toon Force user of the series and not them, which kind of alludes to a type of bias present within all these arguments, but we'll cover that later. Another argument that has a similar theme of being debunked by previous occurrences are, for instance, Luffy running on air with fire trailing behind him, despite the fact that he already knew how to fly with Gear 4, with the whole idea of kicking air being a basic power of Haki, along with the fact that he could produce flames already with the demonstration of the Red Rock. But now, because he's doing it in a far more goofy manner, people now feel inclined to, again, credit Toon Force for this. And not that Luffy being more proficient with his abilities is a byproduct of his Gear 5 transformation, not some outside force unrelated to his Devil Fruit. Speaking of which, the same people will then see Luffy punching through people and don't think it at all contributes to the fact that Gear 5 is the result of his Devil Fruit awakening, which gets stated many times throughout many sources, with Kaido even stating that he's able to transfer his power into things, which in the same fight, instances where Luffy punches through Kaido and launches him, or makes Kaido more elastic while inside him. Which apparently some people see as too far-fetched to be the case that Luffy can alter the properties of people's anatomies with his awakening, despite the fact that this is a series that consists of characters that can literally touch and hurt intangible characters like Kizaru, who is made of light, which Luffy can literally do and punches through him, and is even shown to literally grab lightning and apply the properties of rubber to it, as stated in the Road to Laugh Tale, rewrite the hormones of someone else to make them the opposite sex, and or amplify their physical abilities to resist a fatal poison, which literally happens to Luffy, or literally a character that is able to turn people into toys while simultaneously wiping the memories of everyone they knew of their existence. So why, in Nika's name, does him having a more freewheeling combat style, being the most free while in the form, or that his powers are now only limited to his imagination, means that it can only be a product of Toon Force and not the result of his body and mind finally catching up to the full extent of his Devil Fruit's potential? Why do you think Luffy often refers to Gear 5 as his peak? Maybe because in that case, he's being literal and that it's the full extent of his Devil Fruit's powers and what they're capable of. And while on the topic of interpreting statements, I feel like it's important to discuss the powers only limited by his imagination statement, which seems to be interpreted the same way Goku fanboys like to talk about the other world, in the most literal and highest end interpretation possible. Now, there are many disparities with this being the supposed more correct way to read the statement, with the bottom line being that such a claim, for how it should be interpreted, isn't backed up by the story at all, since it would be claiming that Luffy's creation feats are basically on par with Yuta or even Green Lantern. But obviously, that's not how language works, because in reality, if we isolate words in a vacuum, they don't mean anything unless context is given to give them meaning. For example, if we say, "I love cake," most would just assume I'm talking about cake in regards to the food cake. But if context was given, I would reveal the cake refers to the name of my cat, or even my car. And even if I was talking about the food, what type of cake? What if I said some cake I actively disliked and I only love a few flavors? And we haven't even gotten into how the word like should be interpreted in this statement either. The point is, statements in words get defined by the context surrounding the word, which is the reason why words have multiple definitions in the first place. No one word has a singular meaning. We only assign a definition to a word when we are able to interpret it under a proper context. If we go back to the statement, someone who hasn't read One Piece could see the statement and think that Luffy has Green Lantern powers. But when you read the story, it's clear that this is in reference to how Luffy's awakening allows him to now take full advantage of his rubber powers and beyond, with the only drawback of the form being that it greatly fatigues him. If such a statement was to be made, again, taken at its highest, Luffy would never need to be fatigued since he could just imagine himself to not be fatigued. But the argument doesn't stop there, since people will then cite instances where he creates a pair of goggles and produces a few constructs that resemble stars, in which the baseline interpretation, for a lot of people, is that it's a demonstration of Toon Force. But again, there are many disparities with this line of reasoning. The first being that there is no empirical evidence to demonstrate that Luffy performing these feats must indicate the existence of Toon Force, or that these feats are the result of him utilizing it, when they can just simply be low-tier creation feats unrelated to Toon Force, and less evidence is required since I'm more or less describing what's occurring on screen, as opposed to claiming it's because it's Toon Force, which requires evidence to be presented, with common arguments in favor of this being along the lines of, well, it's a goofy moment, which again, doesn't change anything, since comedic moments can occur within stories without them having to be a result of some omnipresent phenomenon that supposedly gives cartoon characters their powers. Now, as a supplementary point to those who wish to be appeased and want an explanation for the goggles, there are a few cases to be made that most people have already cited as retorts to the Toon Force crowd. The first being that he doesn't create foreign elements outside of rubber to make the goggles, but the goggles could possibly be made out of rubber glass, which yes, is transparent. And another explanation that I like to cite is that Luffy does something akin to Majin Buu, where he takes off a part of himself and then uses his powers, in this case he uses armband hockey, to refine it into a particular shape. Not to mention, it's already mentioned by Kaido that Luffy's body, while he was fighting in a Snake Man form, doesn't completely coincide with how rubber actually functions. So it wouldn't be a stretch to say that Luffy's body is capable of weirder stuff. So unless we're about to double down and say that Majin Buu also has Toon Force, these explanations have more backing than just citing something that isn't proven to exist in One Piece. Now, back to misinterpreting statements, similar claims have been made with the correlation of Gear 5 Luffy defying common sense, which must indicate Toon Force for some reason. Besides repeating myself on the whole idea of how we interpret via context, in a similar vein, the same argument can be made for Blackbeard when he began demonstrating that he now holds Whitebeard's devil fruit alongside his own, despite the fact that eating 2 devil fruits would kill you. So why does Luffy get the Toon Force label and not Blackbeard? Because what Luffy is doing is goofy?
Come on, get the fuck out of here, stop wasting my time.
And the last and final argument we will be going over, which is a two-parter, is the worst argument I have ever seen to support the stance that Luffy has Toon Force. Simply because Crunchyroll said so in a YouTube tagline, and goofy sound effects were used for Luffy in the anime. In case for those who don't understand the absolute ignorance someone would have to claim this, let me break it down. Crunchyroll is a streaming platform that holds the rights to be able to stream literally thousands of different animes, with One Piece being one of the very few. To act like Crunchyroll is an authority on the series of One Piece is to say Crunchyroll has the same level of authority for every single anime they have streaming on their platform, to the point where they have as much say over any series as the actual companies that produce these products. It's more or less claiming that anyone that works at Crunchyroll is this god over what is true within a series, practically as much as Oda. So unless you don't want to handle the burden of proving said claim, this argument is trash. Speaking of trash, goofy sounds mean Toon Force? Let me just retort with one quick scene. I think I made my point. To end this video off, I think it's best to address why inspirations don't just suddenly allude to something being the same. As people often like to cite Oda saying a lot of what Luffy does in Gear 5 is inspired off of Tom and Jerry. Besides the fact that you need to first prove Tom and Jerry have Toon Force to begin with, shocker claim I know, even if they were users of it, why Luffy doing stuff on a similar caliber or having similar abilities doesn't then imply his feats are the result of the same power system of Tom and Jerry. Just because someone produces a fire attack doesn't then mean it's derived from magic, because wizards who use magic are often shown to do that. As well as having magic means that you're capable of all forms of it. It's because of this I don't see why people have this unusual tendency to want to connect anything Luffy does to Toon Force, unless there's a specific reason for why they want to do so. Either they're lazy, and they don't care with coming up with a good reason for Luffy's feats, or they have an explicit agenda to make everyone think Luffy is the modern day Bugs Bunny, which in a lot of people's eyes, this has worked in a way, because if you look up Toon Force, Luffy will now come up. And despite what I say here, this may never change, because there will be those that like Luffy to the point where any argument that supposedly downplays him would often be categorized as slander to him or even Oda. Obviously, that's not the case here. And just like I said in the Goku video, I'm not here to convince everyone, and people will continue to propagate this regardless. But hopefully, for those who were curious or on the fence, I hope you found this video worthwhile. And until the next video, thank you all for watching, and class is dismissed.